And YouTube is just a little slow, but it'll get there eventually. Look at that. All right. Let's get that. Just double check something here. There was a new notification. That looks reasonable. Okay. All right. Hope that everybody is having a wonderful Hanukkah and are looking forward to the next few nights. It's one of the joys of Hanukkah is that you get these multiple times of celebration. Many other holidays, it seems like they're over before they even began. Poor Shavuot, even here in the diaspora where we celebrate for 2 days, it's still a blink of an eye compared to something like Hanukkah, Purim, even more so. It comes and goes like a passing car, but Hanukkah we can enjoy and savor, so make sure you all are. It is now 12:02, which means we've put in our decent little padding for those that are having technical issues. So let's go ahead and get down to work, because I hope you'll find that today, we are looking at something that is not as familiar to many of us, or is familiar, but only in the abstract. And yet, as always, when we dig a little bit more deeply, when we look under the surface, we can find something that is worth a great deal more attention. So we are here in Genesis 41, near the end of the chapter, verse 39. And we are picking up where the story has finally got us. You may remember last week, we finished the parasha with poor Joseph languishing in jail, even though he had just helped the cupbearer with his dream interpretation. The cupbearer did not recommend anything to the Pharaoh, and thus Joseph was still in prison. However, a couple years later, Pharaoh was having dreams that he cannot explain, and now the cupbearer, hoping to curry favor with finding a solution to Pharaoh's problem, now he recommends that Joseph be brought, and Joseph is, and indeed he is able to interpret the dream, and not only interpret what it means, but to lay out a course for what needs to be done next. Pharaoh is so impressed by all of this. Well, that's what we're going to look at. Chapter 41, verse 39. We're picking up with Pharaoh's declaration in recognition of Joseph. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since a God has made you know all this, there is none as wise and discerning as you. You shall be the one over my house. To your orders shall all my people submit. Only by the throne will I be greater than you." So we get this initial statement here from Pharaoh of elevating Joseph, that Joseph is going to become chief over the house. And this seems to be some form of royal title that's being bestowed upon him, Grand Vizier, if you will. And he is making sure that everybody knows that they have to listen to Joseph's orders. But of course, there is the reminder that his throne is still his. And this idea, of course, is trying to ensure that Joseph recognizes that Pharaoh is still superior to Joseph, even if Joseph is now superior to everyone else. Now, this is a huge radical promotion to literally go from jail to number 2 in the entire land of Egypt at the time, one of the most powerful empires on the earth. You don't really get a promotion that is bigger than that. Pharaoh is not done yet. Let me get my mouse back. There we are. Picking up at verse 41. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I place you over all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's hand. And he had him clothed in linen garments and put the gold chain upon his neck. He had him mount the chariot of his second in rank and they called out before him, Avrech, or meaning attention. Thus he placed him over all the land of Egypt. So to back up the words that Pharaoh has already made, we now see the actions. These are very similar types of actions to those that are recommended by Haman when Ahasuerus is asking how should you honor someone, although these are much more permanent in nature. By giving the signet ring, it means that he is able to then sign royal documents, make decrees. Again, this actually happened from Ahasuerus to Haman earlier on. And by dressing him in these fine garments and putting the gold chain upon his neck and having him mount this chariot that has the status markers built in, it is clear that the entire nation of Egypt will recognize Joseph's rulership at this point. The clothing isn't quite as fancy as we see in Shushan, but that's because this is a very different climate and different culture. So Joseph has reached the pinnacle of his career, and he now has the royal trappings as well as the royal approbations to go with it. There's just one thing left to do. Verse 44, Pharaoh said to Joseph, yes, he is continuing his speech, I am Pharaoh, but without you no man shall raise hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name, Safnat Paneach. All right, so that one's a little bit hard, right? Because it is not a common Hebrew word. And that's why our commentators are going to have a field day trying to unpack it. Safnat Paneach is something that does not roll off a Hebrew familiar mouth. This name is being translated here in the section that comes right after it. This is not translated in the text itself. Even though Everett Fox takes the God speaks and he lives as being the translation, the Torah itself does not render that in Hebrew. This is the interpretation. The name itself, Safnat Paneach, seems to be a closed book to the reader, meaning that we are not told what it means. We can interpret, and that's what Fox has done here, and as other commentators will do as well. But the Torah does not help us, which is really unfortunate, because we like when the Torah gives us a name and then gives us the interpretation. But continuing from the text itself, after Pharaoh has given him this name, and he gave him Asnat, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, as a wife, and Joseph's influence went out over the land of Egypt. All right. Now, the second half here is maybe even more surprising than the renaming. All of a sudden, he's getting married. Okay, not so strange, right? Asnat is going to be his bride. We're not sure who she is, but then we are introduced that she is the daughter of Potiphera. Now, if you are an attentive reader, which I know all of my students are, Potiphera does not sound all that different than Potiphar. And who was Potiphar? Well, Potiphar was the person that had bought Joseph when he was still a slave and had placed him as number two. He is the man that ultimately threw him in jail. Is Potiphera the same as Potiphar? Well, our commentary is going to have to discuss that. So we've got a number of things happening here. We have Joseph being given this new name. We have a restatement of Pharaoh, Ani Paro, right? He is restating the fact that he is Pharaoh, which is odd in and of itself. And we are introduced to this character, Potiphera, or reintroduced to Potiphar by a new name. So perhaps this is a second renaming as well. And then we have the completely new person of Asnat, and that is going to need some discussion as well. A lot of naming going on here, a lot of discussion of identities going on here, and we are going to try and unravel as much as we can. Before we jump into that, any questions from either the YouTube chat or from Zoom? All right, then let's get down to our commentary. I think we can get one Zoom level higher. There we are. I always like to have the Zoom be as much as possible for those who are working on their own. A reminder, if you've never looked into my YouTube channel, but under the description of the channel itself, not every episode, because I'm afraid I just don't have the patience to do that, but under the channel description, there is a link to the folder which has all of the handouts if you ever want to just download the PDFs and read them at your leisure or print them out. And Joseph had meanwhile been in Egypt already. Unusual phrasing, says Kedushat Levi. We need to examine why the Torah had to repeat the word in Egypt when it would have sufficed to write while Joseph had already been there. Perhaps the Torah wanted to stress that during all the years that Joseph had been in Egypt without the moral support of his family, he had not changed his name, although Pharaoh had given him an Egyptian title. He himself used to refer to himself by his Jewish name. Even Pharaoh realized this when, during the early days of the famine, he had instructed the people to turn to Joseph for help. What Joseph will tell you, you are to do. So Kedushat Levi is trying to remind us, one, of Joseph's incredible resolve to remain true to the teachings of his family, that is to say, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And as part of that, he was resolved not to give up his Jewish name, his Hebrew name, as it would have been, and which would have not been well received in Egypt. The Hebrews were not a well-liked population in the land of Egypt. So he held on to it. And even though Pharaoh gave him a royal title, we do see that later on, Pharaoh refers to Joseph as Joseph, rather than using the new name. So there is this interesting idea that Joseph didn't completely go native. He may have been promoted to this high rank, but that doesn't mean that he was giving up who he was. It just meant that he was gaining an Egyptian title. Notice as well that this is, in Kedushat Levi's opinion, an Egyptian title itself, that it is not a Hebrew title, but an Egyptian one. The debate of the origin of this title will become significant. As Rashi points out, this name signifies explainer of hidden things. There is no other example in scripture of the word. All right, so Rashi, channeling one of the Midrashim, says that this name is actually a Hebrew word. It's a very rare Hebrew word. It's a very unusual Hebrew word. And you do have to sort of massage it, but you can read it as meaning explainer of hidden things, which certainly seems plausible. And you might be wondering, going back to our text here from Fox, that the God speaks and he lives doesn't seem to have any connection to explainer of hidden things. Well, that is indeed something we're going to have to figure out. Now, Knim has another interpretation as well. This name, this new title that Joseph has received, is an acronym describing a person who is steadfast in the presence of strong urges. I'm sorry. Someone is trying to call me, and I thought I had this on Do Not Disturb. And I will set that now. And I will call them back later. These things happen. So Da'at Zikanim has a different interpretation, that this is an acronym. That's why it sounds so unusual, describing a person who is steadfast in the presence of strong urges to satisfy his libido through sleeping with partners legally forbidden to him, which is a great title. Now, why would he pick this as being his interpretation of this awkward and clumsy name? Well, because that is what Joseph is most famous for. Joseph had a moral compass that, despite being a slave, despite being in a terrible position, still pointed to true north. It still prevented him from sleeping with Potiphar's wife. And that is the sort of thing that should be celebrated. Additionally, it is also trying to resolve a question, which is, well, how can Pharaoh embrace this Joseph Hebrew guy when he was in jail for the attempted rape of an Egyptian woman of some standing? It seems very hard to reconcile. But if in this we now see that when Pharaoh gave him the name, he was acknowledging that Joseph, in fact, was innocent of the charges. Then it also resolves that narrative tension that Pharaoh looked into the matter, realized that Joseph was wrongly accused, and now in this title is basically telling the whole world, this guy was wrongly accused. He never did anything wrong. So when I make him second in command, understand that he is, in fact, a good and moral person, at least good and moral by Egyptian standards of the day. Ibn Ezra takes a little bit more of a straightforward approach. If this is an Egyptian word, then we don't know what it means. He's saying, look, if this is really an Egyptian word, which is kind of what he thinks it might be, then the Torah doesn't give us an explanation of the word. It just gives us the words. And that means it's just words. On the other hand, if this is a Hebrew translation of Joseph's Egyptian name, meaning that Joseph got an Egyptian name, and then we translated that into Hebrew to understand the meaning of his Egyptian name, then we don't know what Joseph's original Egyptian name was. So it's like if I were to say that my name is Yehoshua. If I say that to a random person who doesn't speak Hebrew, they're going to think my name is Yehoshua, and they'll have no idea what it means. Done. But they'll know my Hebrew name, Yehoshua. On the other hand, if I go to a different random person who doesn't know Hebrew, and I tell them that my Hebrew name is God saves, God delivers, they now know the meaning of my name. They know what my name would be in English, but they have no idea what that would sound like in the Hebrew, because, like I said, in my hypothetical, they don't speak Hebrew. So Ibn Ezra's kind of saying logically, we've got one of two choices. Either this name is the actual Egyptian name phonetically rendered into Hebrew, in which case, since we don't speak Egyptian, we don't know what it means, or this name is the Hebrew translation of the Egyptian name, but again, since we don't know Egyptian, we don't know what the original name would have sounded like. Those are the two options. However, if we are working under the assumption that the second interpretation was correct, that this is the Hebrew version explaining the Egyptian name, which we don't know, then in the latter case, in that situation, the meaning of paneach is in accordance with Onkelos' translation. So Onkelos renders paneach as revealed. He renders pnea paneach, a man before whom all secrets are revealed. And here we see Ibn Ezra giving more depth to Rashi's interpretation, that this name is based upon the words for revealing them secrets. And okay, that sort of kind of works in the Hebrew-ish. It's a bit of a stretch. It's a bit of a loose reading of Hebrew. It's not an ironclad translation, because, like Rashi pointed out, the word only appears once in the entire Tanakh, and being a hapax legamikon, I always get tongue-tied on that word, meaning a word that's only shows up once in the entire Bible. We don't have other references to be sure of the translation. So that's Ibn Ezra's interpretation. Rashbam, remembering this is Rashi's grandson, has, again, a more practical interpretation. This is normal for Rashbam, who tends to lean towards practical interpretations. It is a name taken from the Egyptian language, right? He's not maybe this, maybe that, like Ibn Ezra. He is fairly confident. This name ain't Hebrew. This is an Egyptian name based off Egyptian phonetics and Egyptian words. That's what we got. And it was a common practice to link the name of a newly appointed official to his office in some manner, right? That's like the promotion. And we see that happen not only in Egyptian works, but we see that in Jewish works. Moses changed the name of Joshua when he became selected to be one of the 12 spies. Similarly, Daniel, when appointed by high office by the king, was renamed as well. So yeah, this happens. Names get changed when people get promoted. So we would assume the name would be in the language of the person doing the promotion, which means Pharaoh. So sorry, it's an Egyptian word. We're just stuck with it. Better not to translate it at all. Just leave it as the sounds, the phonetics, because that's what it is. Which means we go back to Fox's translation, which is based off the scholarship that led to the JPS translation in 1985, that this is Egyptian for God speaks, he lives, or creator of life. There's some debate on this, which is based upon external information we now have, which our commentators did not have, about Egyptian as a language during this time period. Meaning that since the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and the advanced inquiries into hieroglyphics and the understanding of the syllabary and vocabulary of the ancient Egyptians, we can now approximate for many, many things how it would have sounded in Egyptian, and we can understand what that would have meant in Egyptian. And again, this is ancient Egyptian, remembering that the language of the hieroglyphs was lost for a very long time, even though there was continual occupation of Egypt by different peoples. Actually, how to translate and pronounce the hieroglyphs was lost for a very, very long time. And that means all during the era of the Talmud and during Rashi and all of the other commentators we've mentioned so far, there would have been no one in the world who could have been able to decipher this Egyptian bit of language. However, we now have a good attempt to be able to do so based upon modern scholarship over the last 100, 150 years. And with that modern scholarship, it actually works out to be a fairly plausible Egyptian name, meaning God speaks, he lives. This is why Fox made that translation, because it seems that we have here in this passage in the Torah a reasonably good transmission of a Egyptian word into Hebrew that for most of the last 3,000 years, most Jews would not have understood as being legitimate and meaningful Egyptian. Now, personally, I always find things like this to be stirring, but I recognize that I am perhaps in a minority there. But coming across a passage that is found in the Torah and that has been faithfully reproduced for 3,000 years, that is corroborated by science and research and archaeology that's only developed in the last 150 years or so, is always something that gives me that little shiver in the spine. And I am very grateful for modern scholarship, because it means we can now understand in a glimpse into ancient Egyptian life that helps us illuminate the time that Joseph himself was experiencing. That now we have more for Joseph's understanding, or what Joseph would have understood, that Pharaoh is literally saying, here is somebody that when God speaks to him, we have life. That this is an incredible statement of confidence and of power that is being attached to Joseph. I'll just pause for a second, not only for a drink of tea, but also to let the stream catch up and see if there are any questions. All right, we're just going to turn to Ramban as well to have another little connection, which is equally interesting for similar reasons, in my opinion. According to the opinion of earlier scholars, says Ramban from the Middle Ages, who say that it means explainer of secrets, like we saw from Onkelos that Rashi also adapted, and that this is a Hebrew expression, it is possible that Pharaoh called him by this honorable name in accordance with the language of Joseph's country after he asked him. Or the king may have known the language of Canaan, which was adjacent to Egypt, and its purport is that he reveals concealed matters. So he's trying to figure out, well, is this actually a Hebrew title? And if it is a Hebrew title, why would the Egyptian king be using it? And the solution that he comes to is a rather interesting one. That yes, he argues this might indeed be a Hebrew title. And if it is so, it is because Pharaoh asked Joseph, what title would you like? And Joseph chose a title that was in his own language. Or alternatively, he hypothesizes, perhaps Pharaoh knew the language of Canaan, which might not have been universally Hebrew at this point, but probably was widespread. And he himself or his clerks would have been able to come up with a language of, with a title in the language of the Hebrews that would be fitting. So this is trying to explain, why would Pharaoh give somebody a Hebrew title? Of course, I think we can also argue that as creative a solution as this is, and as very grounded in real-world politics as it would be, and indeed Ramban knew a lot about real-world politics because of his own life, it is still likely that the JPS scholars are right that this is an Egyptian word, meaning God speaks, he lives, or some variation of that. However, the second half of Ramban's interpretation draws our attention to another very famous name given by an Egyptian for a Hebrew. So also did Pharaoh's daughter named Moses, our teacher in the language of his people, for out of the water I pulled him, right? Meshitihu is the interpretation that is given in the book of Exodus for his name. But again, interestingly enough, and with information that we now have that would not have been available to Ramban at the time because of modern scholarship that he was not privy to, just by what century he was living in, we can now say confidently that Moses actually is an Egyptian name. In fact, it is a very common name within Egypt because Moses means son. Like, for example, Ramesses. Ramses, we usually say in English, the second half of his name, Moses, is Moses. It just means son. And with that in mind, we can then look back and say, what did the Pharaoh's daughter say? She said, I am drawing him out of the water and I am naming him son, that I am adopting him formally. It was a statement of establishing the filial connection that she would now have towards this person as a legal link between the two of them, and thus into the entire family. So Moses, as meaning drawn from the water, is a wonderful interpretation that the Torah helps us see as a bridge between the Hebrew language and the Egyptian language. But we can also add now, thanks to modern scholarship, a piece of information that was not considered important enough to preserve in the Torah text itself, but I still find of fascinating interest, that indeed the word Moses means son, which corroborates the story, I think, very powerfully. Okay, but Joseph is not the only one who is named in this section noticeably. We have a number of other people whose names are spelled out in different ways. The first is Pharaoh. Like I mentioned, Pharaoh says, I am Pharaoh, which is kind of strange. It's like, me Tarzan, you Jane. What's exactly going on here? Well, it's a statement of authority. I alone am king, and aside from you, no one is permitted to act freely. So he is reasserting his majesty, his dominion, because he has just given so much authority to Joseph. He wants to make sure no one else thinks they have anything like a similar amount of individual authority, that he is still Pharaoh, and that means Joseph is under him, and only Joseph has the authority to do what he has just talked about. Everyone else is still absolutely under this monarch, which is just another restatement of dominion. But that's not the most interesting, in my opinion, at least this year, naming that happens on here. The other that we saw was, of course, Potiphera. Now, Potiphar, what do we do with this? Well, Rashbam in his standard practice wants to make it clear, Potiphera is not the Potiphar who had acquired Joseph as a slave. Now, as we're going to see, that flies in the face of some of the rabbinic teachings, some of the midrashim, which say that they are the same person, which is why he has to say they're not, because there are some that are saying they are. We'll get to those people in a minute. But Rashbam had no problem trying to establish what he considered to be the cleanest Peshat understanding of the text, the cleanest surface reading of the text. If there is another layer that can be uncovered, hareze meshubach, that is wonderful, no problem there. Of course, you can have other meanings and teachings and insights that are going to be found in the Torah, but make sure you understand the surface meaning first. And in Rashbam's opinion, Potiphera and Potiphar are not the same person because they are not told to be the same person. So why would you jump to the conclusion that they are the same just because they have similar name? If one person is named John and another person is named Jonathan, that doesn't make them the same person, unless we have some other indication that they are the same. So that is Rashbam's style. However, his grandfather Rashi, Potiphera, he is identical with Potiphar. This is the same guy, and he is called Potiphera, Phera, meaning to disturbed or cut, as he became naturally castrated, meaning impotent, since he desired Yosef for male intercourse. So the Talmud here in 13b and Masechet Sota goes into much more detail about Potiphar, having his own designs upon Joseph, and in response to that, he was divinely punished. And the term naturally castrated within rabbinic teachings means that he lost the ability to engage in intercourse, meaning he is now what we in the modern world would call impotent. So he has this as a punishment, and his name is changed as in this way into Potiphera to represent that punishment. Now, if he was punished in that way, what do we do with the fact that we now have a daughter from Potiphar? That if this is the daughter that is being married off to Joseph, how does she fit into this system? Well, first of all, it doesn't have to be his biological daughter, at least according to Rabbeinu Bachya and many other authorities. She was described as the daughter of Potiphar because she had been raised in Potiphar's house. She was so named, meaning daughter of Potiphar, in accordance with Sanhedrin 19, that anyone who raises an orphan in his home is deemed to have given birth to that person. That to be an adoptive parent is to be a parent, and that child should be considered the child of that person who has been raised in their house. So it is perfectly fine to call her the daughter of Potiphar, even if she was not biologically the daughter of Potiphar. Now, it's going to be interesting when we try to unravel her identity in just a moment, but just for a moment, stop and appreciate the beautiful statement here in support of adoptive families, that this is not a lesser degree of family connection, but indeed that this person should still consider those parents as their parents, and those parents should consider those children as their children. All right, so if she is not Potiphar's daughter, then what's going on? Why is he being married to this woman that comes from Potiphar's house? And who is she in the first place? Well, here we get a summary, and there are many different versions of this, but this is the summary that I found most fitting for today of what's going on. Again, this is a midrash. You're welcome to go back to Rashbam and say, these are totally different people. And no one will disagree that that is an invalid position. It's perfectly fine and normative to have that position. But if you would like to see some additional insights our sages have tried to give us about how life works, how community works, and how family works, hold on. If you were to ask why Joseph, who was royalty, would marry the daughter of a commoner, remember that Joseph had previously been a slave in the household of Potiphar. So you might be thinking, wait a minute here. Joseph is descended from Abraham and Sarah. I mean, this is no schlemiel. I mean, sure, he's in a foreign country, but he is still of noble heritage, and that matters. Why would he be marrying this girl of some random guy? But remember, he had been a slave previously in the house of Potiphar, that he had been known as a slave in the land of Egypt. So now, yes, he may be a prince, but he was also a slave. What do? He therefore reasoned that if he were to refuse to marry Asnat, the daughter of his former master, the latter would spread the word that Joseph was really a slave and that he had no business to have risen to such an exalted position. So the arranged marriage was proposed, and Joseph's mind goes into overtime. If I say no, I don't want to marry Potiphar's daughter, then what's Potiphar going to do? Potiphar is going to run around and tell everybody that I was a slave and that I was probably still a slave, and therefore I had no business, running the country. So I'm up against this issue of jealousy and gossip. On the other hand, if he would agree and marry this woman, his former master would honor him henceforth, being proud that through this marriage, he himself now had connections to the highest social circles in Egypt. If he goes ahead and accepts the daughter and marries her, well, now Potiphar is indeed impotent. He is going to be unable to attack Joseph. And why would he? I mean, he would love the idea that he is now connected through his daughter to the second in command of all of Egypt, certainly an elevated position. So if I marry his daughter, it'll shut him up and he will not be trying to attack me or undermine me. And after all, as we know, and Joseph knows, there's a famine coming and we need to prepare, and bickering and gossip and scandal is not great. Now, that by itself would be sufficient to explain why Joseph went ahead and married this woman, even though she was the daughter of Potiphar. But there is an additional reason why he agreed to marry this woman. Hold on to your yarmulkes. As she was actually a descendant of Yaakov. What? This is somehow a descendant of Jacob? Actually, according to which, if you look at the Midrash from Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer that Rashi talks about in Vayishlach, according to which she was the daughter of Dinah from her rape by Shechem. So hopefully you remember the story of Dinah, who was attacked and raped by the Canaanite Shechem, and the problems that came afterwards, the destruction of Shechem city and such. Well, according to this Midrash, Dinah had a daughter, and that daughter was removed from the household of Jacob. There's a couple different versions of that, and I don't want to get into them right now. But according to this particular version, the angel Michael had transported that infant to Egypt where she was then adopted by Potiphar. So we have here the daughter of Dinah, the granddaughter of Jacob, being taken from Canaan down to Egypt, and there she is adopted by Potiphar as his own daughter. This is why the Torah calls her the daughter of Potiphar. So we have a baby that's actually Jacob's granddaughter being raised by this Egyptian, the same one who is eventually going to also buy Joseph. We find that Moses similarly was adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh, and that in Chronicles 1, chapter 4:18, Caleb is reported of his marrying Batya, the daughter of Pharaoh, who had at the time adopted Moses. So this idea of the adoption and marriage across these adopted lines, that's fairly normal in many different interpretations. When Joseph was paraded throughout Egypt, and according to the Torah, all the young ladies threw flowers or jewelry at him, meaning that he wasn't just paraded, but he was celebrated. When he came to Asnat, who did not have anything else to throw, she threw her amulet, which she had worn around her neck at all times. When Joseph looked at the inscription on it, he realized that the girl wearing it was descended from Yaakov, and he went and married her. Okay, so let's make sure we're understanding this narrative, because in typical summary fashion, it's often quite brief on the details. So Dinah gets raped, Dinah gives birth to a child, that child through one form or another ends up in Egypt. There in Egypt, she is wearing this necklace, with a secret inscription on it that no one else knows, and it tells that this is that this is from the family of Jacob. She grows up in the household of Potiphar, treated as his daughter, and when Joseph is being brought around, everybody is celebrating this new miracle wonder kid that is changing the entire Egyptian world and going to save them from famine. And everybody is throwing things, and she doesn't have anything to throw. So in a fit of joy, she throws this necklace that has been with her since she was a baby. Joseph looks at it, and on the back, he can read that says, "This is one of the children of the household of Jacob." And so he's like, I can't let this girl remain apart. I have to bring her back into the family fold, and he marries her. Now you're probably wondering, wait a minute, Dinah's daughter, wouldn't that make Joseph her uncle? And the answer is yes. However, it was not considered either prohibited or undesirable for uncles and nieces to get married in the ancient world. It's not something we do these days, but that was not an unheard of combination in the ancient world. Now, what do we do with this? Well, first of all, we call up Hollywood and we say, have we got a story for you? And, it's almost cliche to have this, but remember, this Midrash was written 2,000 years ago, before a lot of things were cliche. It was much more original at the time. So what do we do with it actually, personally, spiritually? How do we respond to this? Well, we respond to it, in my opinion, in a number of different ways. One, we can go back to Rashbam and say, you know what? This is not the same Potiphar. This is not Dinah's daughter. This is not anything. This is just an Egyptian woman. It's part of his coming up in Egyptian society. And yes, she is able to give birth to Ephraim and Manasseh, and they become stalwart parts of the Jewish people. But this is a whole separate branch, and that's all there is to say. But we can also look at this as being a reunion story. The idea that the daughter of Dinah, who had been taken away from the family after such horrible circumstances, is brought back into the family by Joseph, who also was taken away from the family by horrible circumstances. I find very powerful that Joseph is still looking out for his family and is still trying to help a girl that also was without the rest of the family's support. And for them to come together to build Ephraim and Manasseh, two of the most powerful and prosperous parts of the tribes, is, I believe, making a very powerful statement that you don't throw away people, you don't push them away. What the brothers did was wrong, and even what happened with Dinah's daughter here is wrong. They should have been part of the family entirely. They should have been held together, but at least they both remembered that they should hold each other, that they should cling to one another. Here they are in this foreign language or foreign land, and yet they find each other and they build a family, and that family goes on to be one of the pillars of our nation. I find that to be a very powerful statement. It helps overcome some of the clichéness now from the story sounding so trite in the modern world. And it reminds us of our obligation to reach out to members of our family, hopefully to prevent anyone from ever being pushed to the margins as these two had, but all the more so if someone has been, to try and pull them back in and make sure that they remain part of our people. As we celebrate this holiday of Hanukkah, one of the lessons that we have is that Hanukkah began because of internal strife among the Jews. If we had been able to avoid that, we wouldn't have fallen into the war that led to Hanukkah itself. And while we are grateful for the miracle of our victory and the ability for us to become a strong nation again, let us recognize that we were only becoming strong again because we had weakened ourselves because of the internal strife. That is our first order of business. More important than overcoming our external enemies is finding ways to love and hold on to those that are already within our family. And with that, I will wish everyone a wonderful Hanukkah, as well as a happy continuation to your studies. And I will see you next week.